It's hard to imagine what the musical theater would be like without the efforts of the four gentlemen sitting here with me, the authors of West Side Story.
So I wrote a very brief outline, and I started looking for a producer and collaborators who'd be interested. This was not easy. Producers were not at all interested in doing it.
Jerry called up and gave us this idea and said, "Come over and let me explain it to you." Arthur and I were quite excited by it. What was basically different from the way West Side Story turned out was that it was conceived as taking place on the east side of New York. It was an East Side version of Romeo and Juliet, involving as the feuding parties Catholics and Jews at the Passover Easter season. As a matter of fact, Arthur and I were so excited about it that Arthur wrote some sketched out scenes, one of which was pretty complete.
I remember absolutely none of this. Lenny and I were at the Beverly Hills pool, and Lenny said, "What about doing it about the Chicanos?" In New York, we had the Puerto Ricans. And at that time, the papers were full of stories about juvenile delinquents and gangs. We really got excited and phoned Jerry. And that started the whole thing.
Yes, when we began, I had madly undertaken to do the lyrics as well as the music. But I realized that I couldn't do all that music plus the lyrics and do them well.
I asked Arthur what he was doing, and he told me he was beginning to work on this musical. I asked him who was doing the lyrics, and he said, "We don't have any, because Comden and Green were supposed to do them, but they're in California and maybe tied up with a movie contract. Would you like to come and play your songs for Leonard Bernstein?" I said, "Sure." And the next day, I met Lenny.
I freaked out when Steve came in and sang the songs. From that moment to this, we've been loving colleagues and friends.
Arthur had the hardest job of anybody, converting a Shakespeare play into a musical theater of today. We could make our poetry out of music, dancing, songs, lyrics, but Arthur had the burden of making his text go along with Romeo and Juliet and still communicate some of the poetry, the argot, the drives, and the passions of the 1950s.
Arthur was the most faithful, while others of us sometimes wondered, why do we have to stick to it at this point?
The thing I'm proudest of in telling the story is why she can't get the message through, because of prejudice. I think it's better than the original story. At some point, we began to get a feeling, and Jerry began pounding me on the back saying, "They like it, they like it."
It was an incredible night. It was August in Washington, horribly hot. And none of us knew whether anyone would listen to the show or look at it or stay in the theater. We'd had a lot of insults, a lot of warnings. "You're crazy, give it up," and so forth. At intermission, I remember Justice Felix Frankfurter, the most distinguished man in Washington, in a wheelchair, in tears. And this was only intermission.